Recently, I cleaned up this sword, and if you haven't seen the video, maybe you might want to check it out. But in essence, it was in rather rough shape, pretty dirty, rusty. The blade was completely matte and opaque. So what we uncovered was a little bit of leftover decorations, and more importantly, a maker's mark, a Solingen maker's mark on the ricasso. I also mentioned that this sword is a potentially 1852 Prussian cavalry sabre. And I say potentially because, well, when you buy swords, lots of times, especially on online auctions, you don't really know exactly what you're looking at because not all of the, well, you may not have good pictures and not all of the data is available. So while this hilt is basically a 1852 hilt, you never really know exactly if what you're getting is going to be a regulation version of it or some of the countless custom jobs European officers used to order during the 19th century. And in many cases, these don't have regimental marks, they don't have maker's marks, and their specs are all off compared to what the regulation prescribes. And this makes for a very murky landscape when trying to identify a sword. Sometimes it's just the case that you have a sword, you know it's from sometime in the 19th century, you know that it's kind of inspired by a certain model, and you know nothing more about it. And this one falls somewhere in between. So there's some things we can tell by doing some research. There are some, we can kind of place it in a time and place, but we can't really go into the deep details about it. So I figured what would be interesting for this video maybe is actually go through the research process a little, or when we get to the close-ups, go through specific features of the blade and see how those inform or influence the way I do my research or the kind of information we can gather from it. Anyway, before we actually get to the close-ups, just a quick little bit of context on the official 1852 sabre. It's going to be useful because that's kind of the starting point for the research. So the 1852 is, as the name suggests, adopted in 1852 as a substitute for the 1811 Blücher, so-called Blücher sabre. And the Blücher sabre, if you're familiar with it, is the German clone, let's say, of the British 1796 light cavalry pattern. So it's the stirrup hilt, no protection on the side, very curved, very broad blade. A sword that was a big protagonist during the Napoleonic Wars. However, 50 years later, the Prussians decided it was time for an update. And the update included a couple of changes. The most notable, perhaps, is this semi-basket hilt. So we have a broader protection here on the side of the hand, also on the inside. And the other big change is in the blade, which, well, this isn't a regulation one, but we'll use it as a good example. It is more straight, so more functional for the thrust, and it's also slimmer. However, if you want more information on the regulation version of the 1852, I urge you to check out a video by Pin and Sword. He shows an actual official regulation one and goes through a lot of the details. So very good video, and you should check it out. But the reason why this contextual information is important for us too while looking at this non-regulation version is that it gives us a kind of dating. You would call it a post-quem date, which means a date after which. So basically, if the original official version is adopted in 1852, this sword is from 1852 onwards. And with this first snippet of information, let's dive into the details and check out the sword close up. As the purpose of this video is to take this sword and imagine it just arrived in our collection and then do the research together, let's assume for a moment that we don't know what it is and we haven't done even the preliminary research I mentioned in the introduction to the video. So let's look at what about it is consistent with an 1852, because that's our first assumption. That's why we bought it. So looking at the grip here at the hilt, actually, it is definitely consistent with an 1852. We'll see if you check a bunch of different pictures of 1852s, you have often this gentle curve and the upturned quillin, the solid like cylindrical quillin here. Well, needless to say, the 3 bars on the right side of the guard are there. These also are consistent. There may be difference in shapes. This is something we may notice looking at different 1852s, but this perhaps may not be a dead giveaway of something not being regulation, because we can often see variations of this kind on even official swords. The next thing we would look at is the grip. And even here we have a rather, on a superficial level, perhaps consistent grip with what we may imagine seeing on an 1852. We have the central bulge here with the rivet that goes through the grip and holds the backstrap in place. And we have well, if you look at it, it's actually very similar to the Blücher grip. So if that is the case, then we're on a good track. We also see there's a leather finger ring here, and this also you'll find on a lot of 1852s. Now, moving on to the blade, we'll see it has this straighter configuration compared to the original Blücher, so that is consistent as well. It's slimmer, so if we were to compare this with an 1852, I think on a superficial level we would be satisfied. It may be just that. However, there are also elements that should raise some questions, if not concerns. Well, concerns, I guess, if what we were hoping to buy was a regulation original 1852, and questions if we got the sword on the off chance that we might find something interesting to learn more about. First thing you would notice, and unfortunately you can't hold this, but by picking it up or by simply unpacking it, is that this is not a very big or heavy sword. This is very nimble, very light actually. The blade is really not that thick, so a finger and a half if we're using non-standard measurements, but it doesn't give the feeling of a sword that would be a substitute of the Blücher, which is instead a very, it's a sword with some importance to it, let's say. So the first thing we would do here then is try and figure out something about the weight of the original 1852. There are possible variations, but let's say all of the sources I've found state that the weight of the 1852 is somewhere around the 1 kilo mark. Can be a bit more, can be a bit less, that really depends, but let's say it's around a kilo. And we have our scale ready to go. We can put the sword, balancing it so that the hilt is off of the table here. And we see a weight of 644 grams. So this is very, very far from, it's almost a third off from what the original or what the expected weight of this sword would be if it were to be an actual 1852. A second point of concern or question again is that this sword lacks a screw hole here. So in many 1852s you will see there's a screw coming in from the bottom here, which is holding the finger ring. So the finger ring is basically a leather loop, and it's not fixed, as you can see here. Here it's more, here it looks more like it would look on the IOD 89. So there's a loop that's fitted directly in between the grip and the blade, and this is non-removable. Let's say you have to take apart the blade or the sword to be able to remove it. Whereas a lot of 1852s have a screw that comes up from the bottom, from inside the hilt, and that holds the loop together, and that means it can be easily moved and replaced. Now, a third point, and perhaps as important as the weight aspect, is the lack of regimental markings. So in most, if not all, official issue swords, or swords that were made for the troops to be distributed for combat, you would have regimental markings all over, often more than one. You would often have them cancelled, like crossed off, and new numbers and new markings applied as the sword passes from one regiment or from one unit to another. So the complete lack of these anywhere. Oh, and also, of course, proof marks. So you would, in many German swords, you would have a crown here with the initial, with the monogram of the king. I hope that's in focus. Well, it doesn't really matter because there's no marking here anyway. And then you would have regimental markings on the hilt, on the scabbard, which here is missing though. You would often have them also on the grip, and you would have them in different points of the hilt as well. So there would be no lack of signs and symbols showing you that this is an official sword. There are other data points we could work on and gather and speculate on, based especially on the fact that this sword is so much lighter than the official one. We might want to go look at measurements of the grip, of the hilt, of the blade, like measurements in detail, like the width, the length, and all of these kinds of points, and try and see where these discrepancies lie so that we can figure out most likely that this is a scaled down version of an official 1852. And once we've done all of this work, the conclusion we would probably come to is that this is most likely a custom sword made for some officer that wanted to carry something a little bit lighter and more practical, maybe not in combat, but at least in everyday use. So what we would want to do now is try and verify whether or not there are instances of the 1852 being adapted into a kind of custom version. Do we find similar light versions of it, or do we even find custom versions of the 1852? One interesting source that instead is in a book that I found is in a book by Janusz Jarosławski, which is German swords from the 18th century to the 20th. Nice collection of, well, German swords, of course, and it's a very good reference book. And in his book, he has a version of the 1852, which he describes as a non-official version and dates to around 1900. So now we know that this model of sword was indeed customized. There exist versions that are non-official of it, and these versions are in use at least up to the early 1900s. So now we have a time frame that goes from 1852 to 1900, and we know that within this time frame, this sword is a custom version of an official model, and that these custom versions indeed existed. And you may think, well, that's not a great result, honestly. We knew it was a 19th century sword, so I mean, saying that it's from 1852 to possibly 1900 doesn't really help at all. But the point is, having that information and being able to base your speculations or your hypothesis on something that is corroborated by facts and data. So now that we have this general area of time in which this sword existed, and we know that it's a custom version, so it's not an official version, we can maybe start looking at a few other interesting things about it. So for instance, this paint job. It's red on the hilt, as you'll see, and then it has a gold paint on the grip. And what we may ask ourselves at this point is whether or not this paint is part of the official or the original setup of the sword, or if it was added later and why. And honestly, I don't really have any information about this. We can speculate on a few things. The paint, you can see, is obviously old. It's not something that's been added recently, and it's been added, I would say, relatively carefully. It's not like a sloppy job. You don't see, sometimes when things have been repainted, you really see like drops, and so I don't know what to say about this, honestly. You can also see it's worn in the area where the grip is, so I'm not sure if that says something about holding it, but it definitely is an old paint job, that's all we can say. But there's one thing that we can say about it, and it's here. You can maybe see under here that the ring here, the leather ring, has red paint on it. And while we can't say anything for certain in this case, this makes me think that the paint was added later, at the point when this loop could not be removed anymore, and when they paint it, they got it dirty. And speaking about the loop, there's something interesting, there's some further interesting thing to notice here, and it's that the loop really resembles the one on the IOD 89, not only in the way it's fixed into the sword, but also in the way it's constructed. So if you remember the video I made where we looked at the IOD 89, we had noticed how the loop wasn't a one piece of leather that simply was looped on and then fixed to the blade, but was two little strips of leather that were stitched onto a central something. I don't know if that's leather in the middle or if it's like some cardboard or something like that, but you can see the stitches here as well. So in a version I have of a 1852, it's actually I think a 1879, which is a variation. The loop is a one piece of thick leather. This isn't to say that this loop only exists after 1889 on the IOD Degen, but it's to say that it's similar to that, both in the way it's set up and in the way it's fixed to the blade. So another point that we can then research further into detail. And I have not done that, so I'll leave that up to you. If you want to join in on the investigation on this sword, feel free to look up finger loops on Prussian swords. Another thing, I didn't do research on myself now, but maybe I will, but it's definitely worth mentioning in our hypothetical research you may be doing on this sword, is, and I'm not sure these are visible here, but we'll try, are these, wait, oh no, they're on this side, sorry. Are these remains of decoration on the blade. And while there's very little that can be seen, we can see this kind of peacock tail shape here, these geometrical patterns here, and then it looks like it moves up into floral decoration up here, the kind of standard leaves and that you find on many blades. Yeah, you see them here. But there's very little left of these, not enough really to be able to determine anything about this blade, at least as far as I can tell here. So one thing we could do with this is actually really try and dive into these decorations, try and figure out whether taking some high resolution pictures and playing around with contrast and lighting would enable at least some more shape to come out. But another thing we could do is research the history of etching. So obviously etching is not a technique that has existed, this kind of etching at least, has not existed forever. It's something that comes out at some point around the middle of the 19th century, if I'm not mistaken. So this could also be interesting to research and figure out when exactly. It may give us a date that's useful to us, it may not. It may be from before 1852. And another thing we could do is try and take the elements we can recognize, so this like fanned out decoration here and these geometric elements, and try and see if we can see them on any other blade. And maybe we find them on some other sword in a better condition that we can actually look at. And maybe there's some information there. It might be a specific style of decoration, who knows, from a certain time that represents a certain political moment. And this could give us some more information. Again, I haven't done this because, well, I haven't spent that much time on it yet. And this video isn't so much to give you the information, it's more to give you the way you can find the information. But now I'd like to move on to perhaps the last point of our potential research. And it's the only mark we can see on this sword. This we uncovered by cleaning it, so it was an interesting surprise. And what we see there is a knight's head. So I mentioned in the previous video that this knight's head is a very famous maker's mark from Solingen. I didn't remember exactly who it was, so I did my research on that. And the knight's head is associated with Kirschbaum of Solingen. These were a big family of sword makers that dates all the way back, as far as I know, to the late Middle Ages, and was in activity until the 20th century. So looking at 19th century marks of Kirschbaum, so looking for knight's heads online or on reference books, you'll often find it in combination with a king's head as well. You'll find the king's head and the knight's head together. Anyway, this was a company created in Solingen by the merger of two different companies, which were Weisberg and Kirschbaum. Both of them families with a outstanding and super long history in sword making. The first thing we should know is that the companies merged in 1883, if I'm not mistaken. So starting from 1883, you have a knight's head, a king's head, and a knight's head, which were the symbols of the two families. And as you move on, they add WCK, so yeah, Weisberg and Kirschbaum, their initial. So, with our research done, and assuming we didn't make any gross mistakes in the assumptions we made and in the data we gathered, we can now start describing our sword in a little more detail. And while what we say is still mostly speculation, there are a few data points that can help us make that speculation a little more grounded and act as anchors for further research if we were so inclined. So the first thing we can determine is that the blade dates to a time, or given the maker's mark here, dates to a time that is up to 1862-ish. So given that the style of the hilt comes from a post-1852, this gives us a 10-year window in which, more or less, this sword could have been made. However, this is assuming that the sword was made in one piece in the time the blade was forged. And to counter this idea is the finger loop we've seen here. This is way more similar to swords we see in the late 19th century and moving on into the 20th century. So what this tells us is that either perhaps this was added later on, maybe the blade was, the sword was re-hilted and they added finger loop there, or it could also be that when the sword was made, they used a blade that was from a few decades before, and they hilted it onto a late 19th century version of the 1852 hilt. We don't know. To understand this, we would probably have to, well, take the whole sword apart, hoping that maybe there's some mark on the tang that can help us further, maybe check under the paint whether the tang seems to have been tampered with, maybe look at the profile of this blade and figure out if it refers to any other model of swords that we may know of. One other option is that this is just a composite sword. So it very well may be also that this is simply a hilt and a blade that someone put together at the time of painting it in this rather weird configuration of colors. So which of these options is true is not for us to say at the moment. We need further research to figure that out, but we can kind of say now a few things about the sword that we didn't know before we moved into this video. So I hope this was useful for you. I hope you enjoyed watching it, and if you do have that further research we're missing, please let me know, and if not, I might give a go at it myself and try and figure things out more in detail and report back to you when I have that information. So thank you for watching. I'll see you soon. Bye.